Welcome to our post-event discussion of Known and Strange Things, an evening in conversation with Teju Cole. Cole is an acclaimed award-winning novelist, photographer, critic, and more, and we're going to talk through some of those works this morning. This event is part of a new series, Conversations in the Arts and Ideas at Boston University, a series intended to highlight and elevate the exciting and vibrant work in arts and humanities at BU and beyond. My name is Carrie Preston. I'm the director of Kilachand Honors College and a professor in the English department and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies programs. Before we begin our co-curricular events at Kilachand Honors College, we always offer a land acknowledgement. So I would like to do that now. I acknowledge that Boston University operates on the ancestral, unceded homeland of the Massachusetts people. The anglicized version of their name was taken for the state we now know as Massachusetts, and the words Algonquin meaning Blue Hills refers to the chain of hills that make up what we now call the Blue Hills Reservation to the south of Boston. I acknowledge the painful history of settler colonialism, genocide, and forced removal from this territory. And I honor the many Indigenous peoples still connected to this land. So I recognize the great need to meaningfully engage with the Massachusetts community beyond land acknowledgements like this one. I pay my respects to the elders of the original people of this land who are part of ancient and continuing knowledge. Momentarily, I will type into the chat a link where you can explore the full history of the area in which you live, as I'm recognizing that some of our participants are located far from Massachusetts this morning. Before we get started, I also want to thank the sponsors of this event, BU Center for the Humanities, Kilachand Honors College, the Office of the Provost, the CAS Dean's Office, the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, the BU Arts Initiative, and the CAS Core Curriculum. We thank you for your generous sponsorship. And I want to offer an explicit note of incredible gratitude to co-conspirators Tamsin Flanders and Jim Johnson, without whose work this event and this series would not be possible. I hope you were able to join us last night for Teju Cole's conversation with poet and BU's Vice President and Associate Provost for Community and Inclusion, Crystal Williams. It was vibrant, it was engaged. I told Teju that I was up at 4 a.m. just as he had mentioned in the conversation, and that I thought maybe I needed less interesting reading than some of his works. Blind Spot, which was what I took up last night, and it's Time Magazine Best Book of the Year. Known and Strange Things, the book of essays that this series of events title is based upon, is a Time and Guardian Best Book. Cole is a remarkably eclectic artist who works in the lettery, the diary, the visual story. He is a novelist, essayist, photographer, and art critic. We at Kilachand Honors College have read many of these different genres. The sophomore course on forced displacement has just tackled human archipelago, and the first year studio course has read a number of different essays. I started to think about these eclectic genres using a phrase that Cole used last night when he described searching for the simplest vessel that his thoughts can tolerate. I thought, of course, he has to use many different vessels, and that's part of the exploration and experiment across genres that we see. So Cole, I'm not going to introduce you anymore. I hope that many of us were able to enjoy the conversation last night and get the fuller introduction of your work. But I really want to jump in and let students ask questions. Some of these questions have been sent to me in advance of this morning's event, but I do urge all of you to throw your questions into the Q&A function on your screen, and I will bring them to Teju Cole. But to start, Teju, I hope we could go back to where we ended last night, which
Mm-hmm.
was with the question that you wanted to ask the students. You said, this was your question for people your generation or older, and you wanted to tell them you're doing great, and you said, I feel like we're in your way a little bit, in your way in the sense of getting in your way as you want to remake the world and make it better. And you asked them, how can we get out of your way? So I thought that was just a beautiful articulation in some ways of the job of a professor, a
Yep.
teacher.
Yep.
And so I wondered if you might start by telling us a little bit about how you approach this work of, so to say, getting out of the way in your
Mm-hmm.
classrooms when you're teaching.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Carrie, and for uh, to you and for everybody who made this visit possible. Not the biggest fan of being up early in the morning and thinking deep thoughts, but this is really a pleasure to be doing, and we had such a good spirit around what we did yesterday, and it's exciting to be able to continue that this morning. Yes, I mean, I think that question about how can we best serve our students, presumably, the majority of the people who are listening in this morning are, quite a bit younger than we are, and we've got millennials and Zoomers, and a different experience of the world. And I think one of the complications of it is that we're the professors, we're the ones who have the education and the title and charged with the authority to speak and to direct what things are going to be. And I think pedagogy is very important because we also learn from our elders and people who have had more experience than we have. But I think some of those asymmetries can become a little bit congealed, a little bit rigid, just out of the desire to keep things formal and organized. So, for example, this morning we have a little bit of a problem because we're having a conversation, and I can see a list of student attendees. We have more than 30 people in the room, but I can't see them, nor do they have the opportunity to actually speak. So I would like to say to the people who are listening right now, even though it's a Q and A box, and normally you just use it for your Q, maybe we can get some of the A's from you guys, into the Q&A box. What do you think, since we don't have the chat function available to everyone, what do you think could be an answer to that question? Just give a succinct answer, and I can take up some of them. Then you can also guide the way I think about it. And the question is as follows. What can we do as your professors or as thinkers who are a bit older than you, who are at a different phase in our careers? What can we do to help you figure out how to navigate this political environment that we're in? I think many of you are engaged in this vision of making things better than they actually are. Many of you are engaged with questions of equity and justice, anti-racist thinking, anti-patriarchal thinking. Many of you are against, you're against sex discrimination, you're for trans rights. That is a responsibility that everybody in society shares. But the lead is really being taken by young people. And I do feel like sometimes the olds, we get in your way. So if there's something you think we could do, Gen Xers and boomers or whatever, to get out of your way, you know, what occurs to you? I don't see any activity in the Q&A box. So we've got one. It says, abolish tenure. Okay. We've got another that says, renew your commitment to supporting the political decisions we make without hindering our progressive agenda. Okay, I like that one, but to me, it does sound. And if you don't mind, I'll take these up just briefly. I mean, because tough questions deserve tough answers, and tough answers also deserve tough responses, I think, even though we want to be sort of very open. So renew your commitment to supporting the political decisions we make without hindering our progressive agenda. I like that answer, but I think it's incomplete because even when, I say the desire is to get out of the way of the work you want to do, I don't think it can be as simple as, sign the checks and we'll put whatever number we want into it. I think there has to be a discursive process. There has to be some kind of persuasion has to happen, right? Especially since supporting the political decisions we make, especially since we recognize that there isn't necessarily unity from the progressive end of things. So how do we deal with that lack of a common vision? And is an absolutely common vision desirable, or do we want something of an atmosphere of debate and consideration? Abolishing tenure is an interesting one. I think Professor Preston might have tenure, and I don't. But we both have nice jobs at nice universities. And there's a lot of the people who are teaching you guys, who are your professors and instructors, who are in a much more precarious situation. I think it is worth thinking about how do we reduce their precarity and their vulnerability without increasing precarity for other people. Because, for instance, people who have tenure, in the United States, health insurance is tied to your job. So that's one less person who has to worry about, am I going to fall sick and not be able to pay for it? And there's value to that. And there's putatively an idea also of academic freedom to be able to write what you want without being fired for it. But these are good thoughts to just, put into the spin cycle and think about. One thing that would be great would be offering more perspectives beyond liberal ideologies and being honest with your own perspectives as professors, which, like every human, can be sometimes narrow. Okay. More perspectives beyond liberal ideologies. I do agree that college can be a place to encounter a wide range of views. I think that is absolutely part of the function of an educational environment. The one thing I do hear, though, when we hear something like we should have more than liberal ideologies, what are some of the non-liberal or illiberal or conservative? See, there can be so many antonyms to it. Ideologies that ought to be offered. And I ask that question specifically because the reason so-called liberal ideas are called that is because they do seek actually to be inclusive of many people's rights. So do we come up against a limit there if we also have in the classroom space affirmations of ideas that might be harmful to other people. So for example, ought we, in the spirit of openness and offering a diversity of views, should we have anti-gay pedagogy in the classroom as part of the spirit of, well, there should be a diversity of viewpoints? Or should we recognize that that's actually actively harmful for people who are part of our community? So I hope you guys see what I'm saying. There's a challenge between openness to ideas, but also saying there's actually a proper limit, because total openness, quote, means that then for some people it's not open at all. So if we have a professor who believes that women can't do science, their brains are just not good, and it's just my right to think that because, freedom of speech. Okay, it's your right to think whatever you want, but you are now causing harm because you're actually denigrating the humanity of others. So I don't think only liberal ideas should be in a college setting, but I think forms of argumentation that denigrate the humanity of members of the community probably should not be in the classroom. I would go so far as to say that. But thank you for the candor of these questions. Or answers. One person's answer is encourage dialogue, respect individual thinking, challenge our ideas, and seek and engage with criticism of your own ideas. Yeah, I like that a lot. I mean, I think that's a kind of like a golden mean. It really is the way it should be. I don't know that. I think when we have precarious members of the teaching community, I think the university has real responsibilities to them that it's not taken care of. I don't know that abolishing tenure for Professor Preston is going to necessarily make the community actually better and making her precarious in her job. However, I do think that in the university as a whole, there can be a very authoritarian relationship between professors and students. And, part of again, the webinar context is very inconvenient, but part of the exercise we're doing this morning is I want you guys are pushing back and you're helping me think about certain things. I definitely think that that's something we should foster, because I think because of experience and education, professors might have more of the right answers in certain areas. They absolutely no way have all the right answers. And they seldom have all the right political instincts. In fact, that tends to be more with the students that are being spoken to. So thank you for that answer. Okay, and now we have a question, which is thoughts on the literary canon in 2021. How should we approach canon formation? It's a good question. I think part of the necessity of a canon is a recognition that we can't read everything, right? So we need to figure out what's the best so that we can focus our minds on that. What is necessary, right? Knowing that it's like well, I think it's sometimes thought of as going into a restaurant and you can't order everything. You just have to order some things because you can't eat everything so you order a small handful of things and you get a sense of what's good in that restaurant. But I would actually, to stay with that analogy, I'll open it up a little bit. It's not so much the ordering of something in a restaurant. It's more like, how do you design the menu of a restaurant? And in fact, you also cannot have everything on the menu, right? Because you have to prep some things and you have to make sure things are fresh. You have to go with seasonally available ingredients and all of that. My sense of canon formation is two things. Number one, I think we can actually tolerate a bigger canon than we've been told. In other words, there's room at the top for more voices and more ideas to enter it. And number two, absolutely, I think it calls for humility from everybody involved in education to recognize how the canons were formed that we have inherited, right? Because of what we collectively value as a society, we're very interested in the word great, okay? So that when your parents or, your family members or people who are interested in your welfare encourage you to go to university, help you with your applications, or in very many cases, they're even paying for you to be there. They're paying for you to not only go get professional skills that you can use to make money when you graduate, they're also hoping you will go there and learn something about the values of what is important in our society and our societal heritage. And therefore, you get to Boston University and you're told what is great. Not simply what is true, but what is great, and you ought to know this, right? So, your music classes, Beethoven and Mozart are great, and in English, Shakespeare is great, and so is T.S. Eliot, And I think we do have to undo some of that assumption of this is just great. Well, why is it great? Because it's great. But why is it great? Well, it's always been great. Like, you have to understand that that was arrived at by people who are not us for their own purposes. And maybe it's helpful to start thinking more. Again, I'm still on the canon formation question, to start thinking more about what is good. Not what's on the throne, but what is good, what is helpful, what has something to teach us, and what reflects the kind of community that we have. This is not some very flat notion of identity politics, and now we've got to have like a Latinx person, and now we have to have a queer person on the syllabus, and it's not like that. That ought to be the outcome, but it is more saying, if you have a literature class and it's just Shakespeare and Milton and Thomas Hardy and W.H. Auden, that is explicitly catering to the idea of what the university used to be, which was a place that young white men went to in preparation for taking up their positions of dominance in society. That's not the university's job anymore. It is supposed to be serving the people who are in the university right now. And if you have a syllabus that is just like 9 white men and then 1 other, that is not correct anymore. And just to recognize that there's good work from all across the spectrum, that if you're a white man, you can learn from a Black woman. And that if you're a Black woman, you can learn from an Asian man, And if you're an Asian man, you can learn from a white gender non-binary person. There's no hard wall between you and who might have something helpful to tell you about life. So thinking about canon, I'm going to finish that answer now, is that we have to be honest and confront the unfairness of what it looks like right now and say we can better serve each other by expanding what's in it, and potentially also retiring some stuff that's in there that is not as helpful as it used to be.
Teju, I understand you to be, in terms of talking about canon, to be arguing for something much more difficult than diversifying the canon by putting different voices in it. You're asking us to challenge the standards of greatness that exist.
That's right. That's right. Again, I started by saying, and so somebody has said, who would you exclude from the canon? I'm not sure that's actually a helpful way to think about the question, because I think a question like who would you exclude from the canon is sort of like, okay, who are we ejecting? Who are we canceling? We don't have to do that. We don't have to think of it that way. What we can think of is that in the course of a semester, maybe we can do 15 authors. Okay. Now, this version of the same course in 1980, like maybe really honestly had 15 white dudes on it.
Mhm.
Okay. If we sit down and look at that course again, and we just want to make it richer, I think we can just sit down and say, maybe this is actually the kind of course where we can do 20 authors in it. Or maybe we're stretching ourselves too thin. Maybe we can just have 10 authors on this course. Okay, what should those 10 look like? What's interesting? And we just decide from there, and we decide with open minds, with open hearts. And if at the end of the process, it still looks wonky, look, these are things that are made by people. It's not handed down from heaven as you've got to teach so and so because, oh my God, if you don't teach the Iliad, then education does not mean anything. Says who? I love the Iliad. It's great. But who says, who told you that without the Iliad, it doesn't make sense? Because somebody else could say without Toni Morrison, it doesn't make sense. When 21st century United States of America, she's certainly one of the best novelists we've had in the past 100 years by any objective standard. How can you exclude her? But, you could exclude her and you could exclude the Iliad. I think it has to be a much more organic process and a process that is truly first and foremost committed to an idea of fairness and seeing each other and having a vision for how we want to live together, rather than being up in the ideological ramparts and saying, I'm coming for you, John Milton, because you're, you're a 17th century British man and we don't need that anymore. That is not the attitude, The attitude is to say yes and, yes, Milton, and, and sometimes yes and means moving things around a little bit, Maybe this year we do John Milton, Maybe next year we do Sandra Cisneros, you know. Uh, but for people who are very emotionally invested in what they've been told is unimpeachably great, everything else looks like decoration to them, right? It's like, Sandra Cisneros, are you kidding me? Why is that important? Why should we be studying Roberto Bolaño when we could, have a real writer like, Virginia Woolf or whatever? And we all have to do work on ourselves around those assumptions about what is, quote, unquestionably great and, quote, what's just diversity,
There's a fantastic question that's been offered. How do you define great, Teju?
Um, I'm trying to get away from great,
Yeah.
I'm trying to get away from great. And so I really notice that there's certain things that get discussed. And when the word great comes up, it actually, in a way, it's a way of shutting down the conversation. It's very strange.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we just have great as a way of saying, we're not discussing this. And so I notice to whom that adjective is always attached. And I ask, great is like a coat of varnish that has yellowed with age. And now you can't really see the painting underneath very well. And I want to remove that varnish and I want to see the paint in its freshness. For example, I really like listening to Beethoven. I find his music very inventive. It's surprising. It's humorous, but it's also like I can feel like my brain cells like making new connections. Like, you can follow his music and his mind is really fascinating. Unfortunately, if you read anything about Beethoven, even liner notes, he's often always described as great. That gets in your way because you're just told it's great. If I want to talk to somebody else about Beethoven, they're like, oh, Beethoven, yeah, great. He's great. But people don't think of him as intimate and funny and delightful. And, I would listen to Beethoven and then I'll listen to something by Prince, and then I'll listen to Cardi B, and then I'll go back and listen to Bach. Like our lives are very rich and they contain many different things. I don't need that label of great on something. I just need to know that when I'm listening to something, I'm in it. I'm with it. I'm being accompanied by it. I'm not worshiping it. So, okay, I can't quite completely always avoid using the word great, but I don't think it's a very helpful rubric for deciding what we pay attention to. I think it's sometimes more helpful to think about excellence, to approach something with fresh eyes and to think about the excellence of it. Okay. Now, I really want to get to Trevor's first question here, which is, what is it? What about challenging harmful thinking rather than removing it? Would it not be more beneficial, impactful, and long lasting to our education to host discussions and debates that engage and refute harmful thinking? Trevor, I think that there is something I think there is something useful as having the university as a place for the discussion of ideas, as a place where greatness is not settled and where things are still alive and persuasion is happening. However, this is a very important piece of context, which is that, no line of questioning emerges out of the void. So, for example, your question reminds me of other contexts in which a question like that has emerged. So, on face value, I agree. Let's host these discussions. Let's have debates. Let's engage these forms of harmful thinking and show logically that this is not working. However, we also must think contextually. And the context right now in this country and all across our institutions is that there are people who really get to have their ideas in the public arena a lot because they say that they just want to debate. And they take the most harmful and discursively violent ideas and say, well, why don't we just have an open discussion about it? Why don't we have this person come to campus and talk about this? You don't have to agree. It's a tough one because in many situations, when we're dealing with bad faith actors, we have to say, not only do we not have to agree, we don't have to platform somebody whose thinking is harmful. Now, I know what the next question is. Who decides whose thinking is harmful? It's a good question. It's a good question. But the principle is, if the community can decide that this thinking is harmful, I don't think the community should have to say, but we're going to give it airtime, or we're going to discuss it as if it's just another neutral idea. So, Trevor, an issue we often come across these days, it's somebody saying, why are you afraid of debate? Why don't we just discuss it? And somebody else is saying, I cannot debate my humanity. I mean, I can debate with you whether, you know, the tartness of the apple is preferable to the sweetness of the orange, and I can debate with you whether, a beautiful stone bridge is more, attractive to me than a brilliant suspension bridge made with iron. Or we can discuss whether Leibniz or Newton came up with calculus first based on the historical record, you know. But if somebody wants to come to campus and say, well, my topic of debate today is that Black people are less intelligent than Asian people, and white people are somewhere in the middle. And I just want to debate it. Why are you afraid of debate? How can I debate that? Would I say something so intelligent and so persuasive that every last person in the room will be convinced that the person who asserted that was wrong? That's actually not really how fascism works. Somebody will walk into the room and said, well, I've also always had this thought that Black people are not as intelligent. I'm glad somebody else is saying it. That's actually the way that works. So in other words, sometimes what we call debate, a lot of people are not there for the debate. They're there for the confirmation that these things can be said out loud. So it is not, so when I like your phrase in here, wouldn't it be more beneficial, impactful, and long lasting? Certainly it would be more long lasting, potentially more impactful, beneficial to whom? If we have people in this country who think homosexuality is a crime, should we debate them? Should we debate them? Think about it. If you're gay, do you want that to be a topic of serious chin stroking discussion? So this is not to say nothing offensive should ever come up, but it's to just recognize the political moment we live in, which is that there are many people who are just actually asserting their right to be human and to live as they wish to. And there are other people who, for various reasons, want to make that, not possible. So that's my view on debate. I think debate, frankly, can be helpful, but it is very much overrated. I think sometimes a society needs a consensus on certain big issues of how we want to live, such as a person's dignity and freedom and their equity is not something that's up for debate. Women are just not as, productive as men. Should they be earning the same salaries for the same jobs? That does not need to be debated. That does not need to be debated. The answer to that is, are you crazy? They're equal. They should get absolutely the same money for the same job. And the fact that we're not always doing it right now is a severe problem. Let's fix that. Let's debate things that are worth debating. So that's my attitude.
Teju, there's a related question in the chat, I think, about how you get to that consensus. So this question is, do young people have a responsibility to change the minds of past generations? And I think the spirit of Trevor's question too is, how do we see these terrible divisions in our country. They're so visible right now. how do we get to a consensus? You're absolutely right. Some people do not believe in the humanity of others. How do we change? What is that process like?
I think that history gives a tough answer to that. And the answer is we fight, actually. Um, in various ways. I'm not talking about violence. Violence probably has a role sometimes, but generally, I'm not talking about that. I am talking about the fact that there were a lot of white people who sort of admired Martin Luther King, but the laws were still what they were. And there was all this humiliation that was happening towards white people, towards Black people in the South. And not just humiliation. Do you guys remember how many people in the 50s and 60s got killed in Mississippi for showing up to vote? That seems crazy to us right now. But white folks in Mississippi were just terrified. If you let all these Black people vote, our society will change. And so they were willing to kill them to prevent them from showing up at the polls. You can't debate that. You show up and you get in their faces. You have these mass movements, and then you have people of goodwill join you on that. You have a multiracial coalition. You have nonviolent resistance. You get a lot of people get beaten up by cops. A lot of people get put into prison. And with time, your coalition gets bigger and bigger. It takes a lot of physical courage, a lot of moral courage. You get out there. The same thing happened with the women's movement. At the beginning, it was just, oh, a few crazies. They're trying to be men, you know, they're ugly. They're about, and it became a big movement. Gay rights. Oh, they're just immoral, you know. They just want to party all the time. They just hate God. They're trying to destroy society. But people at Stonewall that were looked at as outliers had to have the courage to do that. And then very painfully, very gradually, and there's still a lot of discrimination, but I don't know the extent to which you can convince people who are determined to hate you. And we're going through the same thing with trans right now. And we're going through the same thing with the class struggle right now. I don't know how much we can convince. What we can do is show up, hold to our beliefs, put ourselves on the line for what we believe, and quite frankly, wait for some of the old people to die out. Some of the old people in the South had to die out for things to actually start to move. So that's the painful answer from history, is that it's a slow process, and nobody gives it up willingly. As a Black person, if I want equality in this country, I cannot depend on the goodwill of white people. I have to get up in their faces and talk about stuff that they don't want to have to listen to the point where they're like, oh my God, you're talking about race all the time. It's like, no, I really have to bother you in order to get you to understand that what's an inconvenience for you is a matter of very profound urgency for me. And I think that shows up again and again and again in these questions of civil rights.
What is the role of the arts for you in this work? And since we've been talking about the university, maybe I'll add that in too.
Yeah.
What is the role of the arts in this change, in social movements that you care about? And is there a role for the university?
I think both the arts and the university play a role of lengthening the note. It's a kind of a sustained pedal. The note is struck by activism. It's struck by the courage of leaders and everyday people. what the arts do is they help us to hold that note. When we, if you have, let's say, a novel that portrays people in their full humanity, or and I'm not talking about protest novels. I'm just saying something that has a complex vision of a possible future. When you go to the protest and the protest ends and you come home, the book still exists. When you like take a non-activist film, like a film called Hale County This Morning, This Evening, a documentary film came out a couple of years ago. It's just about life in Hale County in Alabama, Black people's lives. But it's such a rich picture of their humanity and the complexities of that also does a kind of work in you. These people might not be living in my community, but through film, I feel like I'm in their community. They become vivid and real to me. It does a very different work from minimum wage legislation. It does a very different work from a Black Lives Matter rally. Art helps us encounter something very often in the quieter register, but in a more sustained way. It helps it to permeate into those solitary and thoughtful parts of ourselves. At least it gives us a chance of doing that. I don't believe art can do it by itself, but I think the role of art is important. And I think also the role of the university can be important because you see, the university is like a publisher. A publisher doesn't have to publish everything. The university does not have to platform everyone. If on the one hand, Stephen Miller wants people to die at the border and he wants to make immigrants suffer, and he's like this sort of like cartoon villain, anti-brown sort of figure, he does not have to be invited to give a talk at BU. And even if a student group is like, we want to hear from Stephen Miller, the university can be like, yeah, sure, you can hear from Stephen Miller, but you can't do it on campus. That role can be played. So the university can help set an agenda. Now, if there's somebody who is on the right-leaning side of the political spectrum, it does not mean that that person cannot speak on campus. But we have to hold people accountable for their views and for the damage that they do to other people's lives. And that is part of the role of the university. And that is part of the reason a university is often sort of private, so that they can do what they need to do without having to be shouted down by people who think they should be neutral. In questions of injustice, to be neutral means you take the side of the oppressor. Okay.
We moved into displacement and human movement and migration a little bit in that last response. And there's a wonderful question here from Amaya. In Human Archipelago, one thing I found powerful was when you expressed the idea of recognizing an unknown person as a stranger versus simply not recognizing them. Are there some things that we should expect to learn when encountering an unknown person? Or is it better to approach the interaction and not expect anything? That is to say, approach them simply to approach them without the motive of making them someone known.
Well, that's a really beautiful and poetic question. And I just want to sit with the poetry of that. I don't know that it necessarily needs a direct answer. I mean, the answer very often is to just, yes, to be there with somebody else, you know. But I like the way it's framed, because for me, the idea is that, you know, those of us who are a bit more science-minded can often talk about, you know, everything being solutions oriented, right? Um, uh, and I don't think everything has to be solutions oriented. Sometimes the beginning, even though there might be a solution at some point in the journey, sometimes the beginning of the encounter is just to be there with, and to jump over the hurdles that have been put in front of us by our community and our society, and to actually experience that other person as a human. You know, no conclusion has been jumped to yet. I don't want to go from 0 to 100 right away and say, this person, this is what should happen in the both houses of Congress, and this is what the president should sign. You know, the first step sometimes is to move that person out of being an abstraction. You know, so for example, you know, we've had these people who are being turned away at the border right now. Arduous, very, very difficult journey from places like Guatemala. They get to the US-Mexico border, they cross, and they're picked up and they're just dumped back in Mexico. If that were me, my heart would be so broken. And if that were me and I had like my two kids with me, and, you know, maybe my elderly parent, my heart would not just be broken, I would be devastated. Okay, it's not me. But how can I get to the point where I understand that this person is like me? You know, before we even get into all policy and everything. I mean, I think that is really what underpins the idea of human rights. You know, to believe that the other person is human. And a lot of what we think of as the deepest brutalities of history, it seems to me, I'm not completely sure about this, but it seems to me that in order to do those deepest brutalities, you have to kind of convince yourself that they're not quite human like you. You know, I think it would be very, very hard to put somebody into the hold of a slave ship, or to put them on a plantation, or to send them to a death camp, if you really thought that they were as human as your own mother. If you really thought that, you would not be able to do it. So so we have to rehuman. Well, they don't have to be rehuman, but we have to rehuman our attitude to them. If you think about the people on the border and you say that they're truly, truly human, they're like us, that still leaves us with a tough political problem. But it's a tough political problem that starts from the point of view that these are human beings we're dealing with, and not just human beings, but that they're like us. How would we want to be treated in that situation? So to say these things is not to be politically naive, but it's to say, what should our starting points be? If your starting point is, okay, they're not like us, you know, their country should take care of them, what should we care? That you'll end up with one set of responses. If your starting point is, actually, just as we sometimes have very little say in what our government does to us, people in Guatemala, people in Honduras sometimes have very little say in what their government does to them. If we lived there, we would be just as vulnerable, and we would feel it's just as much our right to go where something is better. You know, a lot of people in this room right now, you go to BU, for college, but you're not from Boston, you know, you're from New Jersey, you're from New Hampshire or Maine, you know, you're from Arizona, got into BU, fantastic school, you want to go to Boston. What do? You get on the plane and you go there. Why? Why are you allowed to do that? Just go somewhere because you want to go to college there? What do you mean why? It's my right. I can move around this country as I wish to. So many of us just take freedom of movement as a sensible, natural right. Why wouldn't I go to BU when obviously it's going to make I can study what I want with fantastic faculty and get a prestigious university degree. Why would I not do it? Exactly. You can. Just like somebody who's saying, the farms are failing and there are no jobs in my town. I'm going to move somewhere else because it's better for my life. The difference is not very dramatic. So
You're touching here on so many of the questions that students sent in about human archipelago. So one of them is, the student notices that you write a lot about hospitality and kinship rather than rights and international law in human archipelago, and sent these messages of hospitality against the photographs, the images that are either close-ups of people's faces or huge pullback on a Palestinian village that has been decimated, or the outlines of a camp for a displaced person that was destroyed. So the student asked the question, do you think the refugee regime's focus on human rights is misguided? Do you think that human migration is a fundamental human right and that nations are wrong to attempt to limit migration? And setting those questions about rights against what feels to the student as a different register, the register of hospitality and kinship.
Love the question. Very subtle and intricate question. And in the sophisticated reading by that student, they're picking up on something I've put implicitly into the way I approach human archipelago, which is that precisely I'm not really talking a whole lot about laws and regimes of rule, partly because there is something problematic about human rights. Ooh, that's a weird one to say, right? People are like, what could possibly be wrong with human rights? But if you think of human rights as a limited assortment of agreements that have to do with granting people a minimum in a way that does not ruffle the feathers of hegemonic powers, there is something a little bit problematic about human rights, right? So the idea that human rights were sort of invented in the 20th century and universalized and have consequently been used as a tool of foreign war making by Western hegemonic powers, right? Thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in their home countries by, let's say, the American military in the name of human rights, right? So that we recognize what's good in human rights. It's a kind of discourse about how universally we should be treated equally. In practice, it becomes a container for some other things, right? So that, for example, we really believe that we're living up to our responsibilities under the Geneva Convention and the Human Rights Conventions right now, vis-a-vis what's happening on the US-Mexico border. We're a law-abiding nation. People continue to die there in great numbers and to be in absolutely terrifying misery and to be in conditions that we would recognize as in no way compatible with the treatment of precious human souls. You know, so I mean, this is a much more complicated thing to get into that will require a lot more time. But I'm proposing that before we reduce the crises that we face into it's a human rights issue, and almost as if once we say that, we've made our official speech and we're done. I sometimes, and I guess this is a prerogative of a writer, I sometimes want to pull it back and say, much more softly, much more gently, and say, who is this? Whose eyes am I looking into? Who is this person? Why is this happening to them? Why am I doing this to them? In what ways am I contributing to what is happening to them? I don't want to abstract what is happening to people in Xinjiang. I don't want to abstract what is happening to people in Myanmar and just say, oh yes, the Burmese military should obey human rights. It's not an abstract problem. There are people who are undergoing monumental suffering, and it's quite clear that on a national and an international level, our rubrics and our rhetorical commitments are not sufficient to what is going on. We talk a good game about human rights, but out of that same discourse emerges the satisfaction or assumption that some people have that Palestinians will just remain under occupation forever. That might be compatible with a, quote, human rights argument. It's not really compatible with a fellow humanity argument. You know, human rights is compatible with mass incarceration somehow. But mass incarceration and this is my fellow human who's like me? Why should my fellow human be in prison for, you know, a crime and be in prison for a lifetime for a crime in which nobody died, nobody was raped? That's so. So the book is trying to do a very small thing, just to sort of wake us up to less mechanical ways of thinking about seeing somebody else's face, somebody who has been harmed by, you know.
The students in several classes have been talking about the relationship between text and photograph in your work. And one of these questions comes out of that study. The student asks, you've written about the ethics of photography and media, of developing ethical or moral ways of seeing. And the question is, how can we use media like photography to document violence and injustice, just as you're talking, without aestheticizing it, or without the risk of dehumanizing the subjects being documented?
Yeah, it's a very tough question because photography is aesthetic, you know, and if you're a gifted photographer, you're almost, quote, doomed to making a picture that is going to look beautiful, even if it's of something horrible. I think one of the surprising things that I have learned, at least in this century, that maybe a lot of people were not necessarily thinking about in the 20th century, is that it matters who's making what. You know, back then we just thought, oh, fantastic photo. You know, there was such a thing as a war photographer. There's still some, but they were these cool dudes. They, at great personal risk, they got amazing photos of conflict and that got published in Life magazine or in Time magazine. Now, when I look at a picture, I actually ask, who took the picture? And for whom was it taken? You know, who's in the picture, who took it, and where is it being published? Now, younger me would have been offended by that question, would have said, I don't care about that. You know, the picture is either awesome or it's not. I don't think that's the point anymore. I still like excellence in photography, but excellence is a multipartite thing. Who took the picture? Who do they intend to show it to? After all, a photograph is a kind of social gesture. If the photo is taken and never shown, well, then it's not really, you know, a tree falls in the forest, nobody hears it. If a photo is taken and never shown, it does not really function as a photograph. A photograph is meant to be seen. So if, for example, a European photographer goes to Liberia and takes photographs of children dying of Ebola and publishes it in a German magazine, that's one network over there. That photo was not, it was made of the children in Liberia, but it was not made for them. Now, the German magazine has a ready answer for this. They'll say, oh, we just want to raise awareness. Okay, but you're raising awareness in a way that's actually not, number one, really not doing anything for those kids in Liberia. You're raising awareness among your German viewers who over breakfast are consuming images of African misery. And none of them are Liberian children. So in a lot of photography that's even about the other, about the world, you have this assumption of white people talking to white people. Which is fine, but it completely dominates the visual space. What would it look like to make photographs for Liberian children in which they can see something that says something to them? What would it look like to have photographs made by Liberians for a European audience, or made by Liberians for a Liberian audience, or made by Liberians for a Ugandan audience? You know, it turns out that in photography, who's doing the looking subtly but very, very crucially affects what is being seen. I mean, to just like make a side parallel move for a second, when you look at pictures of even of beautiful people, even of bodies, like intimate type photos, for example, of somebody in their home, and it's supposed to be a photo of a beautiful person. If it's a guy taking photos of women, those photos look a certain way. If it's a woman taking a photo of women, those photos look a certain way. The camera is a mechanical tool. But at this point, it's actually quite hard for a man to take a picture of a woman with not many clothes on and not have it be somehow sort of gross. There's a man taking a picture of a woman with not many clothes on, and implicitly he's taking that picture to be looked at by other men. That's never stated out loud, but when you see the picture, you can tell. If a woman is taking a picture of a woman with just that same amount of clothes on, the vibe can be quite different because the woman on the other side of the lens, number one, is responding in a certain way because of who's taking the photo. But the photo itself is being taken in a certain way because the imagined audience for it might be different. You know, these are sort of very subtle things that it can actually be hard for us to accept because we've been taught, we've been tutored into thinking that photography is neutral. You know, again, it's just a photo. Don't bring race and gender into everything, you know. But the evidence is almost always there. You know, if a poor person is being photographed or imaged in some way by somebody who is well off, it can look a certain way. If they're being imaged by somebody who is of the same class, I mean, I'm thinking about the difference between something like even concerned photography, all the people who have photographed in the inner city, Lois Hine photographing in Philadelphia, these working children, you know, back in the early 20th century, those photos look one way. If you take Latoya Ruby Frazier, who herself grew up as an impoverished Black woman in Braddock, Pennsylvania, and you look at her pictures of Braddock, yes, you can see the poverty and the devastation, but you can just see the tenderness, the intimacy. She has not turned them into a subject. She has photographed as if she's in the room. And they respond to her not by looking directly at the camera, but in their bodies, they respond to her as if she is not aiming a weapon at them. You know, so those things actually very much matter. And those are questions that every photo editor should be asking, and very often they don't, because they, even till today, photo editors are saying, does the photo bang or does it not? You know, is it cool or is it not? But there are ethical questions that always ought to be asked.
Teju, we are near the end of our time, but I'm so grateful for your wisdom and your openness and graciousness this morning. I wonder if there's, on the one hand, anything you feel really urgent that you want to share with the students at this moment in time. And students sent in a number of questions related to the impact of COVID on your art, on your beliefs, on your activism, on your life. Many of our students read the powerful essay that started with the diary of your days in May under lockdown. And I think we're responding to that statement that felt so real to their lives right now as well. So I wonder if you would want to give us a taste of what you think COVID has done to you and to your work, and what the future might hold after the moment of the vaccine and after this world changes again.
Well, you know, thank you so much. And thank you all very much. All those of you who are here, for all the time you spent reading my work. Thank you all for all the time you spent here today. Again, I wish I could see your faces, but you know, I feel your energy and I feel your thoughtfulness through your various questions. And I'm very, very grateful. It's been a hard and devastating year for so many of us. And you know, we acknowledge, especially the people we have lost. I think because of the protest movements last summer and because of the outcome of the election cycle, I think there's also a moment of hope and the ramping up of vaccination. I think all I'm just going to say is, you know, don't lose heart, especially those of you who are activists in a progressive way. I promise you the world will never be fixed, but that's okay. We all have our own individual roles to play in repair, right? Think about it. We can't fix it. Actually, sometimes to fix something means to make it rigid and hard. To repair means to stitch. That is happening, that will happen. And that gives me a lot of hope, you know? I am learning so much about how I want to be in the world and where my priorities are. Priorities that have to do with care and attentiveness and not being afraid. And I just see that more and more in so many people. Mutual aid, you know, really radical thinking, you know. I think up till a few years ago, like definitely huge mainstream consensus was that hypercapitalism is what we have and that is what we're stuck with. But now lots and lots of people I see around me are thinking, maybe hypercapitalism is not the only way. Maybe the market is not the only truth. Maybe there are duties of care and showing up for each other that supersede the right of some imaginary person to become a billionaire, you know? So that's what I want you to leave you guys with. I don't think that the world can be solved, and that's okay. But do I think that we can make it better in our time with the years that we have, long or short as they may be? I absolutely do think that, you know. It is simultaneously kind of a depressing moment, but it's a very, very, very hopeful moment because look at the conversations we're having. These are not necessarily conversations that were being like mainstream broadcast conversations at BU 15 years ago. But now it's happening on the university level where, okay, institutions are always going to be slow and they're always going to try to like capture our labor and say, look, we did our bit. That's the institution. But as people, we know that we're now putting this discourse out there. We're thinking about these things. Doesn't mean we won't argue with each other, but if somebody in our community is going to try to be racist, they're going to have to do it in private. If somebody's going to try to be misogynist or transphobic, I mean, they're welcome to it, but we're going to give them grief about it. You know, I think those are real signs of hope, you know. And I think we're also sending out the signal for people who are basically like, oh, this country used to be great before you people started making trouble, you know. People who just wanted to go back to being whatever it is that their fantasy of the America was before. I think they should also get the message that we're nice, but we're not weak, you know, like that determination to fight that a lot of progressive people have, you know. Like I'm definitely not here on some kind of guru kind of like, oh, all things should be peaceful. No, like there's actually going to be a fight and we're not afraid of opposition or conflict in the pursuit of this. You know, I might stand with MLK, but I also stand with Malcolm X. in recognizing the responsibilities of urgency. And I think a lot of young progressives also agree with that, is that sometimes we're going to show up in quite a disruptive way to, but the disruption generally doesn't happen until you've been ignored for a long time, So like people don't just suddenly wake up one morning and be like, we're going to go push over a statue. They don't. They do it only after like years and years of every peaceful avenue has been like pushed away and insulted. And they're like, so you really want something visible and striking, right? Okay. People like just suffer for years and years and years, but then the media only covers it when like the window of a Starbucks is broken. Well, that's why people break the windows of a Starbucks, because that seems to be the only sound you people recognize, in the mainstream media. So it's a moment of hope, and I feel hopeful, and I hope most of you do as well.
Teju, thank you so much for this vision of hope and for your work and your artistry and for the time you've given us this morning. I also want to thank those who are with us this morning, joining the conversation. We will go out on this note of hope and gratitude. Take good care, everyone.
Thank you all. Take care of yourselves. Thank you very much, Carrie. Bye-bye.